The fact that we can define sexuality in different ways tells us that sexual orientation, just like gender, is a social construction. Yes, sexuality may have biological roots, but what's more important is that we give our sexual attraction and sexual behavior social meaning. The idea that sexuality is a social construction means that there are multiple sexualities out there. We don't just have sexuality with no distinction between different kinds. For example, we don't introduce ourselves and say, "Hi, I'm a sexual." Instead, in our society, we attach a modifier like hetero, homo, bi, a, or pan to that word. As social beings, we set different sexualities apart from one another, as if they are different. This helps to create a sense of social order within society, and that system becomes objectified and internalized as second nature, ultimately demanding our conformity. We then police the categories, forcing people to choose one or another, even if the category doesn't fully or even adequately reflect who they are. Also, by policing the boundaries, we ensure that people conform to the expectations for their particular box, so that straight people are always supposed to think, feel, and behave in this way, while queer identifying people are supposed to think, feel, and behave in that way. Again, sexuality is socially shaped. What this ultimately means is that being heterosexual is just as much a product of learning, social pressure, and definition as homosexuality or bisexuality are, or dominant or submissive. You have to learn to be a heterosexual because there are normative expectations for how you do it correctly. So the question you should reflect on is, how do you learn this? How do people learn to be heterosexual? What are the normative expectations for being straight? We can talk about this during class. There's something else that we need to acknowledge here as well. The idea that sexuality is based off of the meaning we give it also tells us that sexuality is not necessarily physiologically or psychologically fixed for life. Because our subjective experiences are subject to change, our sexuality can, when viewed from an outside perspective, be perceived as evolving or changing. It can also be redefined by society without our behavior ever changing. Consider the example of a dominant male who has sex with other men. In those parts of the world that construct sexuality using the Roman model, his behavior would not be considered deviant. But if he flew to the United States, his sexual behavior would be perceived very differently, and he would be labeled gay even if he didn't identify himself as such. In other words, he and his behavior haven't changed. Instead, what changed were the social definitions in the world around him. But sometimes it's not the definitions in the world around us that change. It's our own subjective experience of our sexuality that changes. Some argue that this demonstrates that sexuality is fluid. This can be very disturbing for those of us who feel secure or want to feel secure in our sexuality, no matter what sexuality we're talking about. We don't like the idea that it can appear to change or flow or exist outside of the predetermined sexuality boxes. What this all boils down to is that sexuality, just like gender, is a human experience and one that defies accurate categorization. In the first place, as we've seen, the categories vary from one culture to another, revealing that such categories are arbitrary at best. Secondly, simple categories, boxes, assume that there's no variation within the boxes, as if all gay people are the same, and as if all straight people are the same. Even if you limit this to sexual behavior, there's incredible variety, which makes the categories less than informative and potentially very misleading. Another problem with failing to recognize the variations within categories is that it allows people to assume that everyone in the same box are all alike when they're not. It allows some straight people, for example, to assume that all lesbians are alike or all gay men are alike. It also allows some queer people to assume that all straight people are alike. But that's just using stereotypes. We know not all women are alike, not all men are alike, and this is true for all categories. So those in these queer sexuality boxes are just as diverse as those in the straight box. Finally, categories are static by nature, meaning we assume they don't change. But as a human experience, sexuality seems to be much more dynamic than that, and therefore cannot be contained by static categories. In fact, there are a number of people, including celebrities, who prefer not to identify within the given binary of sexual orientation and who see themselves as more fluid in terms of their sexuality, including actor and model Nico Tortorella, whom you may recognize from the movies Scream 4 and The Following. There's actor Anne Heche, who has done a bunch of movies, as well as the TV show Hung. Another example would be Niall DeMarco, who is a model, actor, and deaf activist. He's known for the shows Switched at Birth and America's Next Top Model. There's Miley Cyrus, whom nobody can seem to figure out. And then there's rapper and lyricist Angel Hayes. The bottom line is that more and more people are stepping outside of the socially defined categories of human sexuality for a whole host of reasons, and we're really seeing the limitations of these boxes, regardless of whether they are based on the Roman or the Greek models.